Iawn, wel, bore da. Gobeithio bod chi wedi llwyddo i ymuno gyda ni. A ta pyna ddolen i chi wedi gwasgu, mae yna groeso mawr i chi fan hyn. Croeso cynnes i'r gynhadledd heddwch ac iechyd. We're very grateful to Heledd Davis, who is translating this morning's session. And so if you would find it easier to listen to this in English, then do please press the globe icon where Heledd is ready and waiting. Any problems on this, then send a message in the Q&A, and the very able Amira and Nell, and thanks to both for being here all day, will sort things out. So, and now we shall begin. Felly, gai ddiolch i'r Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol ac i Brifysgol Aberystwyth am y cydweithio adeiladol i'n galluogi ni fel Academi Heddwch Cymru lwyfannu'r digwyddiad hwn. Mae rhyw elfen o arbrawf yn perthyn iddo, a chewn ni weld sut a'i chi. Ond, fel y gwyddoch chi, os ydych chi eisoes wedi gwylio fideo Craig Owen, sef rhan cyn raglen yn cynhadledd ni, enw llawn yr adeilad sy'n gartre i'r Academi yw y Deml Heddwch ac Iechyd. Ac yn sicr mae'r ddau beth mawr yna yn mynd law yn llaw. Roedd hwn yn fantra gan y diweddar athro John Wyn Owen, a fi'n ysgogwr mor frwd i'r Academi Heddwch, ac i ni'n teimlo a diolch am ei anogaethau hyd heddiw. Bydde hi'n amhosib peidio a nodi ein bod ni'n cynnal y digwyddiad hwn yng nghysgod rhyfel arall eto fyth. A'r tro yma efalle'n fwy nag erioed i ni yng Nghymru'n gweld tystiolaeth a'n llyged yn hunain o reality trais grym arfog. Cyflafan, gweidlyd, creulon, ac rydyn ni'n dyheu am heddwch. Heddwch fel nod, ond hefyd fel ffordd. Nid yn unig diwedd i ryfel y dylai heddwch fod, ond ffordd o fyw. Ac mwyn i hynny fod, mae angen sicrhau byd o iechyd da i bopeth byw. Nawr, yn ystod y dydd byddwn ni'n cael cyfraniadau amrywiol iawn. Mae hyn yn adlewyrchu'r ymateb difyr gawson ni i'r alwad am bapurau ac i ehangder y maes. Defnyddiais i'r gair arbrawf. Y bwriad yw defnyddio heddiw fel cyfle i ni ystyried y math o lwybrau y gallwn ni dilyn ac y dylen ni i harchwilio ymhellach. Ac hwylistod i chi, na i ofyn i Amira roi'r rhaglen yn Gymraeg ac yn ddwyieithog yn y chat ynghyd â'r ddolen i gyflwyniad Craig, rhag ofn nad ydych chi eto wedi weld. Dyma agor felly ran gynta'r diwrnod, ac yn gwmni i mi mae 4 gŵr doeth. Dr Rowan Williams, cyn Archesgob Cymru a Chaergaint, ysgolhaig, awdur, bugail yr ysbryd os cael ddweud hynny, a bardd ymhlith llu o bethau cwbl nodedig eraill. Cadeirydd Academi Heddwch. Yr athro Colin McGuinness, un o ddirprwy is-ganghellorion Prifysgol Aberystwyth, a chanddo gadair bersonol yn yr adran wleidyddiaeth ryngwladol, ac mae'n gyfarwyddwr Comisiwn Cenedlaethol UNESCO ymhlith llawer. A'r Dr Hefin Jones, arbenigwr byd-eang yn maes ecoleg ac entomoleg, ac un sy'n amlwg a gweithgar i wasanaeth i bob math o gymdeithasau yng Nghymru, ac sydd ar ben popeth yn gyfarwyddwr addysg israddedig ym Mhrifysgol Caerdydd. Yma hefyd mae Craig Owen, myfyriwr ôl-radd yn adran wleidyddiaeth ryngwladol Aberystwyth ac ymgynghorydd treftadaeth Canolfan Materion Rhyngwladol Cymru. Nawr, dylen ni nodi bod newid bach i'r rhaglen oherwydd streic sy'n effeithio ar 2 o brifysgolion Cymru, ac i ni'n meddwl am ein cydweithwyr yn y sefydliadau hynny. Pen draw hyn yw bod ychydig mwy o le gyda ni i anadlu'r bore yma, ac felly os bydd angen, gallwn ni gael cyfle i holi cwestiynau wrth Craig wedi'r egwyl, a'i wahodd i ymuno gyda'r athro Richard Bowen yn y rhan nesaf. Iawn. Wel, hynny o ragymadrodd. Tro'r siaradwyr, a'ch tro chitha i wrando arnyn nhw gan godi cwestiynau yn y Q&A, a byddwn ni'n troi at rheini wedi gwrando'r cyflwyniadau i gyd. Gai ymdawelu felly, a gofyn i gadeirydd Academi Heddwch ddad-fiwtio ei hunan, i ni'n disgwyl yn eiddgar am eich sylwadau, athro Dr Williams.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Mererid. Bore da a chroeso cynnes i bawb. Mae'n fraint mawr i mi gweithio fel gadeirydd Academi Heddwch. And at the moment, it's, as Mererid has said, a particularly poignant time for us to be thinking about peace. But it is, as she's also indicated, an occasion for thinking more deeply and more searchingly about the connection of all that we say about peace with the other crises and the other challenges that our world faces. We are used to hearing, quite rightly, that peace is not simply the absence of conflict. The absence of conflict can be simply the way in which we brush under the carpet ongoing needs, ongoing tragedies and difficulties that we find too difficult to face. And any such peace is always going to be deeply fragile, deeply vulnerable. So I'd like us to begin today by thinking about peace as a way of sharing goods between human beings. A workable, durable peace is a state of affairs in which there is free, equal access to the goods of our environment for all members of the human family. Any peace which steps back from that ideal, that goal of a full and open sharing of goods is always going to be unstable. We may never in this world and this life reach that level of active and just peace. But it's against that standard, I believe, that we test whatever we do and whatever we say for the sake of peace. Which means that if we are serious about peace, we're going to be serious about the sharing of the world's goods. Peace can't be the freezing of an unjust or unequal situation in a sort of uneasy stasis. As I've said, it will always be vulnerable. It will always be fragile. So, if peace is connected with just sharing, which means fair access to the common goods of our human environment, that immediately connects us with the theme of health. Because health is intimately bound up, as we're becoming more and more aware, with justice. The challenges in terms of health faced by people in our own nation, as well as people worldwide, the challenges around health are deeply connected with challenges around economic inequality, access and voice in the public sphere. When we look at levels of health and life expectancy in parts of Wales, let alone across the world, we are looking, in fact, at issues that are quite inseparable from a history of disadvantage and inequality. We know that life expectancy is deeply affected by unemployment, morale, a sense of worth in people's lives and in people's communities. And anything that we say about health, about peace, must take on board challenges of that kind around health and the interweaving of health issues and inequality. And when we look at the global scene here, we can note that this is not simply about levels of health care, important as that is. During the pandemic, various people, including Gordon Brown, underlined very strongly the way in which the pandemic bears most heavily on those countries where there is imperfect and unequal infrastructure in terms of healthcare. We see it to some extent, of course, once again in our own midst. But I'm not talking simply about healthcare, important as that is. I'm also talking about those dimensions of health which have to do with the natural environment. We're going to be thinking today about water as an issue which brings together some of these issues. And that does indeed focus our minds very strongly on this question of the environment as a factor in both peace and health. We know quite well that the provision of clean water supply is a crucial factor in public health. We know that its availability in the context of public health then becomes a factor in the viability, the durability of a society overall. It's part of what gives stability to the background. And once we think about clean water, two issues immediately come into focus. One is, of course, the degree of pollution that affects water supply worldwide, largely as a result of irresponsible industrialization, but also issues around access to water as a factor in conflict between communities and between nations. There are many examples worldwide, and I've no doubt we'll be hearing something about them, which underline the fact that access to dependable water supply again and again emerges as a factor driving conflict. But apart from those two considerations, we can put this still more widely in a global context where desertification and salination are major factors in climate change-driven environmental degradation. And once again, we can't separate issues of peace or of health from that wider context of the environmental challenge that we face. Essentially then, what I've wanted to do in these very brief introductory remarks is to make what I think are necessary connections. What we say about peace is bound up with considerations about health. Looking at those factors which make for a durable, sustainable, and reliable public health environment, as well as personal health, we're bound to think of political factors, but also of environmental factors. These three elements of peace and health and environmental justice are so closely bound up that to try to solve or address any one of them without factoring in the others is a recipe for failure, perhaps even worse, compounding the difficulty. So my hope is that in our discussions today, we will keep those three balls in the air very firmly. If one can keep balls in the air firmly, I think you see what I mean, forgive the metaphor, but we need to keep moving between those perspectives because each one illuminates both the others. Trying to address one without the others won't do. We are, as we know, bitterly and clearly, we are in a fragile world. The fragility of that world is going to be intensified if our response is fragmented and incoherent. So much of our response is indeed fragmented and incoherent. We try to address health issues without addressing underlying questions about political and social morale, about environmental sustainability and so forth. We try to address environmental questions without looking at how they bite in the political world and in the area of conflict. We try to bring about an end to conflict and reconciliation without planning for that durable and sustainable future in which people have access to the goods they need to live humanly. So I hope that we shall step away from fractured, fragmented responses, looking towards a more integral response to the needs of our world. And what better place, what better context than this temple of peace and health in which we are virtually gathered today. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, Rowan. Wel, dyna ni, dal tair pelen ar yr un pryd. Dwi'n deall y metafor, dyfyrred ydyw. A fi hefyd yn deall bod chi ar ychydig o brynder amser bore yma, efallai byddwch chi'n diflannu o'r rhythfyd hwn cyn diwedd y sesiwn, ond dymuniadau gorau gyda'r gwaith pwysig sydd o'ch blaen chi heddiw hefyd. Wel, nawr i ni'n troi at yr athro Colin McInnes, sydd, fel y gwelwch chi, mewn lle godidog heddiw. Dwi'n siŵr bod Aberystwyth ar ei gorau. A heddiw mae am fynd i'r afael a'r cysylltiad cymleth rhwng iechyd a heddwch gan olrain y bont hanesyddol rhwng iechyd a rhyfela, poblogaeth iach, neu'n sicr milwyr cryfion, y gyfystyr a rhyfela effeithiol. Ond wedyn edrych ar bont dra gwahanol hefyd, un sy'n gweld poblogaeth iach fel ffordd o atal rhyfel, ac ebos mynd i gydio yn rhai o sylwadau rwan. Yr heddwch adeiladol hwn sy'n cymaint mwy nag absenoldeb rhyfel fel clywson ni eisoes. Ac yn dilyn Colin bydd Hefin. Mae Hefin am siarad yn Gymraeg, ond dwi'n meddwl mae yn Saesneg y bydd Colin yn ein hannerch ni heddiw. Felly Colin, ata ti os gweled i bod yn dda.
Thank you very much, Mererid, and as ever, you're far more articulate than I can ever aspire to be, so thank you for that. I'm going to attempt to share screen, so apologies if this doesn't work, but here we go. And then this goes up, and hopefully I can do this. And hopefully that's worked. Mererid is kindly nodding her head, so it's working. Thank you, everyone. And my background is in a Department of International Politics, and it's really a great pleasure for me, both to talk about some of the issues which I used to think about on a daily basis, but also to talk to this, I believe, the first meeting of the Academy. Mererid has already mentioned John Winowen, who was instrumental in the foundation of the Academy and in getting a group of us together to start to think about it. And huge credit goes to John. But John was also vitally important in my own life and in my own professional development. He was in very many senses a mentor to me in the last 2 decades of his life. And I'll be forever grateful to John for his inspiration in many things. And one of the things John was interested in was the link between trying to bring together 2 disparate communities, the health community and the foreign policy community. So I'm especially pleased to have been able to talk this morning about this sort of area to the Academy, which was part of what he was working on in the last years of his life. So at first glance, this should be an easy ask. It seems obvious, doesn't it, that health and peace share the same intellectual space, share the same policy space. They should be very much in each other's gloves, in each other's hands, working closely together. And this is, after all, part of the Enlightenment tradition about improving the human condition. It's part of the liberal agenda, the norms which we've lived with since the Enlightenment about human progress and making life better for us on the planet. But actually, what I want to reflect on a little bit is how they've been strange bedfellows. They haven't worked closely together. And it's only on odd occasions that you've actually seen health and peace talked of in the same breath. So I want to reflect a little bit on that. And then I want to throw a challenge down to the Academy about where they go with this idea. So what I want to suggest is that if you look back through history, the dominant narrative has not been health and peace, it's been health and war for a number of fairly straightforward reasons, I would suggest. First and most obvious, the cost of war on health. And I'm not thinking simply about casualties, the direct casualties of war, which we're seeing in such a dreadful manner on our television screens now, not only from combat, but also through destruction of infrastructure. Hospitals are being affected, as we see today in Ukraine, but also indirect costs, refugee flows, poverty increased, and poverty is defined by the World Health Organization as a disease. Hunger. There's a terrible report on the Today programme about the manner in which people in Ukraine have been without food for days. And wider infrastructure changes on clean water, such as Rowan has been speaking about a few minutes ago. There's also a lot of literature and a lot of thinking done about health and military efficiency. Disease historically has caused far more casualties in war than combat has. The illustration I've put on here is from the Siege of Harfleur, which was immediately before the Battle of Agincourt. And this is one of the foundational moments for English history. And the reason why Henry V was so short of troops was he'd lost so many during the Siege of Harfleur to cholera. So if there hadn't been the cholera outbreak in the troops besieging Harfleur, we wouldn't have had the outnumbered English and indeed Welsh archers at the Battle of Agincourt, a foundational moment in English and indeed British history. Through to the Vietnam War, where sexually transmitted infections caused far more casualties than combat against the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. So health and military efficiency has been bound up very, very closely together. And then most tragically, of course, we see health used as a weapon of war. We hear in the news today the threat of the Russians using biological weapons in Ukraine, and such weapons have been under development for well over a century now. But even more horrifying are the reports which came out of Rwandan genocide, of rape of women and women being raped by soldiers infected with HIV, and using HIV as a terror weapon during the Rwandan genocide to add to the almost unimaginable suffering which occurred to that. Imagine being a woman being raped is a terrible crime, but being raped by somebody who claims that they're HIV positive adds to that terror. Almost certainly, this was not the case, that many of those women so tragically raped were not infected with HIV, but disease was used as a weapon of terror. So if historically, we've seen that the narrative has been about health and war, the thinking has been about health and war, many of the policies have been how you deal with the health consequences of war, or health as a weapon of war. Things began to change, and this is the progressive moment, I suppose, which we saw really gathering steam in the 1970s through into the millennium just about. And I think this came about for a number of reasons. Underpinning it was what was then rather disparagingly called the third world, the rise of the third world, what we now call low-income countries, perhaps, in world politics. But the dominance of the two superpowers in world politics was being challenged by the non-aligned movement, and that their interests were very different from those of the two superpowers and the two main blocs which constituted the Cold War. And in particular, they brought two key ideas into a mainstream of thinking about global politics: sustainable development, and, as Rowan's already mentioned, positive peace. And to a certain extent, these two ideas are intrinsically linked. But positive peace, as Rowan has already articulated, is the idea that peace is more than simply the absence of war, and the absence of war was what dominated the Cold War, the prevention of a nuclear apocalypse. Rather, what this change in the zeitgeist brought about was a sense that positive peace required much more than the absence of war. It required sustainable development and human dignity. And this shift from the state to the individual was central to ideas of human security. But security was no longer, or shouldn't be, simply couched in terms of the defense of the state, but was about the individual's freedom from want and the individual's freedom from fear. As the Commission on Human Security, with Amartya Sen and Agartha, put it, these are the two central freedoms which constitute human security: the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. So a very different idea of what peace was started to be developed, and central to that was health. Health provided freedom from fear, health provided from freedom from want. From fear because of fear of disease, fear of death, fear of morbidity. Freedom from want because of the manner in which, for many people in the world, poor health would mean an inability to work, an inability to get the food you need, an inability to generate income for your family. And so health started to become much more central to thinking in global politics in the 1970s through to the early years of the millennium. And we saw this in a number of policies. I put down health as a bridge for peace, but predating that were days of tranquility in South America, in some of the conflicts in South America, where you'd have a day of tranquility when conflict ceased, to allow vaccination and other health initiatives for the people. And this was seen as not simply a health initiative, but hopefully building the idea that a ceasefire was possible and eventually that the conflict might end. So it was a building block. And this was articulated much more clearly in the Bosnian conflict, when health as a bridge for peace became a policy. And the idea here was that if you could bring warring communities together in a health setting, then you might build bridges between communities. And so if you had a hospital which served multiple communities and where the staff were drawn from multiple communities, because health had this superordinate quality, then you could start to build bridges and break down concerns of communities about the other, make the other a friend rather than an enemy. And so I think from 70s onwards, we started to get a rather different view that health could very much be part of a progressive notion of global politics linked to ideas of sustainable development and positive peace. We're not there now. We're clearly not there now. And I think a number of things have happened which have undermined this progressive moment which we saw a few decades ago. And I'd identify three main reasons, I think, for this. The first is the rise of this idea of soft power, of rather than sort of coercing people to get your way in the world, it's far better to get people to like you, to want to emulate you, to be on your side of the fence. And it's the power of attraction and the way in which health could be used as a tool of soft power. So either investments in healthcare or direct engagement with healthcare could be used as a tool of soft power to attract people to your way of thinking. Hillary Clinton, in her hearings as Secretary of State, mentioned soft power in excess of 36 times in her prepared statement for her confirmation hearings, and linked it quite often to the idea of health initiatives. So all of a sudden, instead of health being above politics and something you do for the sake of humanity and for the sake of other human beings on the planet, health started to be a tool or an instrument of foreign policy, and therefore inevitably partisan. And then, of course, we have the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the shift, particularly in the West, towards thinking about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism politics. And an Australian infantryman, a man called David Kilcullen, is probably the most important thinker during this time about how to conduct these wars. Remember, of course, that these were not wars which many armies in the West had engaged in since Vietnam. And so thinking about the challenge of Iraq and Afghanistan was something new for him, and Kilcullen produced what he termed 28 articles about how to do this. But central to his thinking was that counterinsurgency was armed social work. And so what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan was health being used very much as part of a counterinsurgency strategy. And this ranged from strategic investments, building hospitals, building health infrastructure, to demonstrate how America, or the West more generally, was on your side, through to what was termed tailgate medicine. So you'd get an American patrol going through a village, they'd have embedded medics who'd do impromptu clinics, literally off a tailgate. And so health started to become not just politicized, but militarized in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we've got COVID and the culture wars. And I think what we've seen is something odd going on about health and politics. Health has always been political. I think we'd be naive to think otherwise, but the sort of politics around health has generally been about how much to spend on health, taxation policies, those sorts of things. What to spend it on, primary health care or downstream campaigns to treat people once they become ill. And who is health for? How you access a health service. The American model versus the British model, for example. And that's what we're used to. That's the sort of health politics we're used to. We're seeing a very different health politics now, and a much more acerbic, and sometimes, I'm afraid, quite nasty health politics. And this is part of the polarization of politics. It's part of a culture wars in a sense of where moral values sit in a human polity. And it came to, I think, a head with COVID, but we already saw a lot of this in the debates in America over abortion issues. And COVID saw a straightforward political divide between individual rights and collective well-being. A well-worn political theory, political philosophy distinction, the rights of the individual versus rights of the collective. but we've worked through in COVID in a very, very clear manner over vaccination campaigns, where the interests of the majority in people being vaccinated ran up against individual choice and individual rights. And so health, firstly through abortion and then through COVID, became not simply part of a usual political discourse, but part of a much deeper political philosophizing, but also quite vicious at times. And so I think when we think about health and peace now, we see fractured communities who are using health sometimes as a cipher for political division. So my challenge is this, sort of having left you on a depressing note, I want to offer a challenge to you, to all of us really. How do we reestablish health and peace as a progressive combination? How do we think about the way in which health initiatives can construct sustainable development and positive peace? What can we do as individual citizens and as citizens within Wales and as global citizens to try and effect positive change, to reduce this sort of rather nasty debate we're in at the moment about health and peace and the way in which health has become instrumentalized, and think instead of health as superordinate and something which we can use to build positive, peaceful communities. So I've done a bit of a historical review and I've done a little bit of a challenge at the end, and I hope there's something there which will pique interest for discussion afterwards. And I'll leave you with a nice view of Aberystwyth. How about that? And it is, as Mairead suggested, an absolutely glorious day here, and it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Diolch o galon I ti, Colin. Dyna beth oedd profiad I bigo'n cydwybod ni ac I ddeffro sawl cwestiwn. Oeddwn i'n bersonol yn ddigon falch o glywed y cloc cwcw tua'r 10 o'r gloch. Dwi'n meddwl mai o dy ffenest di ddath hwnna ac meddwl am fy mam gi yn gwrando am y gog bob blwyddyn. Falle hytrach yn gynnar, ond oedd yn dda i'w glywed e. Ie, wel, dyna beth oedd cyflwyniad i'n sobri ni ac i'n herio ni hefyd, a diolch arbennig I ti am dynnu sylw y pellach at John Wyn Owen, fel o'n i'n awgrymu'n yn yr cyflwyniad, yn ddyn pwysig iawn ac I ni'n gweld I eisiau fe heb os. Nawn ni ddal y sylwadau yn ôl, oherwydd dwi'n sicr bydd nifer o sylwadau, mae gen I restr fan hyn o bethau ofyn. Dwi'n credu mae'n mynd draw at Hefin a newn ni nawr, a wedyn gewn ni amser ar y diwedd. Felly ie, dwi ddim yn gwybod a ydy Dr Hefin Jones am ganu fel Hugh Jones o'i flanau, ond dŵr yw ei destun e. I ni'n profi'n siar o ddŵr yng Nghymru, ac o falle oherwydd hynny ni'n tueddu I dan brysio fe. Dwi'n cofio gweld yr Alhambra am y tro cyntaf, rhyfeddu at y ffynonau dŵr yna, a sylweddoli wrth gwrs i'r bobl oedd wedi dod I Sbaen o diroedd hyd yn oed sychach, roedd gallu brolio bod ganddyn nhw ddigon o ddŵr i'w daflu'r awyr yn arwydd o'i statws nhw. Wel dyna ni, ond heddi bydd Dr Jones yn ein hatal ni rhag tanbrysio hwn heddi ac yn archwilio'r cysylltiad rhwng yr elfen hanfodol hon ac iechyd ond heddwch byd hefyd. Hefyn, wyt ti eisiau rhannu sgrin hefyd? Dwi'n meddwl falle dy fod ti.
Ydw, diolch yn fawr iawn, Mairead. Good morning. Bore da. Fe na I rannu y sgrin yn y gobeith ddau'n medru gwneud hynny. Dyna ni, ydy pawb yn gweld y sgrin. Gwych, diolch yn fawr iawn. Gai ddiolch felly am y croeso I ddod i'r gynhadledd hon ac I anerch, a dwi'n gwerthfawrogi yr hyn mae Rowan a Colin eisoes wedi dweud ac wedi creu llwybr a dweud y gwir i'r hyn dwi am siarad amdano fe fel gwyddonydd, fel ecolegydd ar ddŵr a heddwch. A dwi am ddechrau drwy difynnu geiriau Koichiro Matsura, sef cyn gyfarwyddwr cyffredinol asiantaeth UNESCO. A mi nath ddweud, water is probably the only natural resource to touch all aspects of human civilization. A da ni wedi clywed hynny eisoes yn y ddwy sgwrs da ni wedi ei gael. all aspects of human civilization, from agricultural and industrial development to the cultural and religious values embedded in society. Life on Earth began in water, and the connection between life and water remain unbroken. The development of legal frameworks for the equitable sharing of water resources is key to peace and stability, without which there can be no development. Nid rhywbeth newydd yw prinder dŵr o gwbl. Fe gawn ni hanes Isaac yn llyfr Genesis yn ymfudo i ddyffryn Gerar. Fe ath ati ail gloddio'r pydywed dŵr a gloddiwyd adeg ei dad Abraham ac yna geiwyd gan y Philistiaid. Ac fe arweiniodd y cloddio at gynnen rhwng bugeiliaid Isaac a bugeiliaid Gerar. Ni bia'r dŵr, dyna oedd datganiad y ddwy ochr. Bu Moses yn arwen ei bobl drwy'r anialwch, da chi'n cofio'r daith o anialwch Sin ac yna ymsefydlu a gwersyllu yn ardal Rephidim. Ond nid oedd yno ddŵr i yfed. Fe drodd y bobl yn erbyn Moses, fe frawychwyd Moses, y maent bron am llybyddio. Mae dŵr yn un o hanfodion bywyd, a hebddo fe ni fedrwn ni oroesi. Mae prinder ohono fe yn chwerwi, yn difetha, ac yn y pen draw, mae gyda fe'r potensial i arwen at ladd. Felly dŵr, 2 atom o hydrogen ac 1 o ocsigen. Hydrogen, y bom hydrogen, math o arf niwclear sy'n ffrwydro o'r egni dwys ar ryddheir gan ymasiad isotopau hydrogen, deuteriwm a tritiwm. Ac yna ocsigen, y derbynydd electron mwyaf effeithiol ar ein planed ni. Dyma'r elfen fi'n hanfodol i ddatblygiad esblygol ffurfiau bywyd aerobic o'r organebau amlgellog gyntaf i'r anifeiliaid asgwrn cefn, i ni fel dynoliaeth. Hanfodol ar gyfer ysbiradaeth cellog ym mhob organeb aerobig. Hydrogen, ocsigen, dŵr, dinistr ac ymrafael, bywyd ac iechyd. Yng Ngogledd-ddwyren Syria, mae lefelau dŵr afon fawr yr Euphrates sy'n llifo i lawr o Dwrci, fel mae'r map hwn yn dangos, wedi gostwng yn sylweddol. Mae hyn yn bygwth dros 5 miliwn o bobl, gan gynnwys miliwn o Syried sydd wedi ei dadleoli ac erbyn hyn wedi ei lleoli'n bennaf mewn gwersylloedd dros dro ar hyd y ffin. Nawr, mae Twrci yn rhoi'r bai am y gystyniad aruthrol yn llif yr Euphrates yn llif y dŵr ar sychder, ond mae llawer iawn yn ei ystyried yn symudiad gwleidyddol i wanhau'r ymladdwyr yn y diriogaeth. Ers ymosodiad milwrol Twrci ar ogledd-ddwyrain Syria mis Hydref 2019, mae'r cyflenwad dŵr o orsaf ddŵr Alwc, a ydych chi'n gweld rhan o'r orsaf ddŵr yn y llun fan hyn, wedi ei dorri'n ysfeidiol reolaeth. Dyma'r union gyflenwad sy'n cyflenwi dŵr i'r gwersylloedd ffoaduriaid ar ardal gyfagos. Yn Ninas Hazakeh, sy'n dibynnu ar Alwc, yn y flwyddyn 2020, yng nghanol cyfnod lledaeniad difrifol y pandemig Covid-19, fe syrthiodd 500,000 o bobl i sefyllfa o fod heb ddŵr dibynadwy, a hynny yn anterth yr haf pan gyrhaeddodd y tymeredd 50 gradd. Creuwyd o ddŵr arfwr ddiweddaraf yn y gwrthdaro. Drwy feddiannu dŵr a is-strwythurau, fe llwyddwyd i arfogi adnodd naturiol a'i ddefnyddio i drosoli pŵer dros eraill. Mae'r arbenigwyr sy'n gwylio'r argyfwng yn Syria yn pryderu y gall y tactegau rhyfela hyn sy'n gysylltiedig â dŵr adael etifeddiaeth niweidiol a gosod esiampl beryglus digwydd yn gallu gwledydd a grymoedd milwraethus eraill sy'n gwrthdaro geisio i hailadrodd. A da ni wedi clywed rwan a Colin yn sôn am hyn eisoes. Medde Tobias Van Losso, sef ymchwilydd cyfraith rhyngwladol yn yr Haag, mae'r ffaith i'r dull hwn o arfogi ddod yn normalrwydd dros gyfnod o ddegawd ac yn digwydd mor aml, rywsut wedi newid y safonau o ran sut mae dŵr yn cael ei drin yn ystod gwrthdaro. Hydrogen, ocsigen, dinistyr, bywyd. Felly dwi wedi sôn am yr agweddau negyddol. Mae rhaid ni gofio gweitha hyn wrth, mae dŵr hefyd yn helpu ddod â phoblogaethau ynghyd a lleddfu tensiynau. Gall dŵr fod yn allweddol i ddod â heddwch i gymdeithas ddyrchiedig Syria enghraifft. Mae gwaith y Cenhedloedd Unedig yn Syria yn canolbwyntio ar adnabod rhanbarthau sydd nid yn unig angen systemau dŵr i'w hadsefydlu, ond lle gellir defnyddio dŵr fel cymedrolwr cymdeithasol rhwng cymunedau i ddechrau atgywirio'r cytundeb cymdeithasol sydd wedi torri mor amlwg erbyn hyn. Felly un enghraifft yw Syria, fe gawn ni nifer o enghreifftiau eraill ar draws y blaned. Mae dinas Mecsico, mae'r ddinas hon, mae'n suddo o ganlyniad i'r holl ddŵr sy'n cael ei bwmpio allan o dan ei sylfaeni hi. A ydych chi'n gweld peth o'r difrod yn y llun ar y sleid. Mae'r ddinas yn tynnu 80% o'i dŵr o dani, oddi tani. Ac 1910, sef ychydig dros ganrif yn ôl bellach, mae'r ddinas wedi gostwng dros 5 medr mewn rhai mannau. Ewch chi llyn Chad sydd ar y ffin rhwng Chad, Niger, Nigeria a'r Cameroon. Mae'r llyn hwn wedi crebachu, a ydych chi'n gweld y crebachu'n digwydd yn y glas ar y wahanol ddyddiadau. Wedi crebachu 90% dros y 30 mlynedd diwetha, ers i'r sychder cronig gynyddu ar ddechrau'r 1970au. Yn 1963, fe roedd y llyn yn gorchuddio arwynebedd o 26,000 kilometr sgwar. Mae hyn bellach wedi gostwng i llai na 1,500 kilometr sgwar. Mae'r Nil yn chwarae rhan bwysig yn mywydau dros 130 miliwn o bobl mewn 10 gwlad. Dyma unig ffynhonnell ddŵr gwlad yr Aifft. Mae Tanzania ac Ethiopia yn dyfrhau eu cnydau ohoni. Mae Llywodraeth Cairo wedi datgan eu bod nhw'n fodlon defnyddio grym milwrol i sicrhau cyflenwadau digonol i'w thrigolion. Bod gwlad yr Iorddonen ac Israel yn ddibynnol ar afon yr Iorddonen, Israel sy'n rheoli'r llif, ac mewn sychder mae Israel wedi torri'r cyflenwadau i'r Iorddonen mwyn sicrhau digon iddi hi. Mae lefel môr y Galilea, fel ydych chi'n gweld yn y llun ac yn y graff hefyd yn dangos y gostyngiad, mae lefel môr Galilea wedi gostwng yn ystod y blynyddoedd diwetha, gan greu gofid y bydd yna gynnydd yn halltuneb y dŵr, ac felly yn lleihau'r gronfa sydd ar gael i'w defnyddio. A mae'r Palestiniaid, sydd hefyd â'i dŵr yn cael ei reoli gan yr Israeliaid, yn achwyn am gyflenwadau ysbeidiol a drud. Be sydd gennych chi fan hyn yw map llun o'r rhewlif Gantori. Dyma i chi ffynhonnell y Ganges. Ac fe welwch chi o edrych ar y llunellau, fe welwch chi sut mae'r rhewlif hwn wedi lleihau dros yn blynyddoedd o 1965 i 2006. Mae wedi lleihau rhyw 30 metr y flwyddyn. Mae India wedi adeiladu argae ar gyfeirio'r afon i Calcutta, a mae hyn wedi lleihau faint o ddŵr sy'n llifo lawr i Bangladesh. Bydd Delta Bangladesh wrth gwrs, lle mae rhyw 65% o boblogaeth y wlad yn byw, yn un o'r mannau cyntaf i fynd o dan doner môr wrth i newid hinsawdd gymryd effaith ar y blaned. Fe amcan gyfrifir y bydd hyn yn arwain at filiynau o ffoaduriaid amgylcheddol. Pob un ohono nhw eisiau dŵr fresh. Dyna y delta I chi fan yna. Dŵr fresh. Dŵr yw'r adnodd mwyaf cyffredin ar y blaned. Ond eto, dim ond rhyw 2.5% o'r dŵr sydd yn fresh ac ar gael i'w yfed. Dŵr heli yw'r gweddill. O'r 2.5% sydd ar gael i'w yfed, mae rhyw 2/3 ohono fe ynghlwm mewn mynyddoedd a llifiannau iâ ac yn y gorchydd eira. Mae yna brinder dŵr fresh dybryd ar y blaned. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. Ga i nawr dynnu'ch sylw chi at 2 ddogfen bwysig gan Peter Glake ar y berthynas rhwng dŵr ac ymrafel rhyngwladol. Y gynta'n canolbwyntio ar y dwyrain canol, Water, War and Peace in the Middle East, a'r ail ar agweddau yn ymwneud â'r berthynas gyffredinol rhwng dŵr a holl genhedloedd y byd. Water and conflict. Yn y 2 ddogfen, fe restrir nifer o ffyrdd y gall dŵr fod yn arf dinistriol ac yn fodd i fygwth heddwch rhyngwladol. Yn gyntaf, perchnogaeth cyflenwadau dŵr fresh. Yn 1962, bu fethiant mewn trafodaethau rhwng Brasil a Paraguay am berchnogaeth o rannau o afon Panama arwen i sawl ffrwgwd lleol. Dipyn diweddarach yn 2001 pan dorwyd y cyflenwad dŵr i Kumanovo yn Macedonia gan Albania, bu brwydro ffyrnig rhwng y 2 genedl. Fe all gwenwyno cyflenwadau dŵr neu wahardd dŵr rhag llifo fod yn arf milwrol ynddo hun. Yn 1991, fe ddefnyddiodd Irac, ddwn ni'n cofio hyn, fe ddefnyddiodd Irac fomiau i ddinistrio offerth a trio dihalwyno Kuwait wrth iddo nhw gilio ar ddiwedd rhyfel gynta'r Gwlff. Mae dŵr wedi chwarae rhan ganolog yn y brwydro yn Sudan. Fe ddefnyddiwyd bomiau, er enghraifft, yn mwrdeistrefi Tina i ddinistrio ffynhonnau dŵr. Weithiau fe ellir defnyddio dŵr fel arf gwleidyddol i ennill tir ac adnoddau. Diwedd y ganrif ddiwetha 1999, fe ddefnyddiodd NATO fomiau i ddinistrio llif dŵr fresh i Belgrade. Ac yna chydig blynyddoedd yn ddiweddarach fe fomiwyd cyflenwadau dŵr Kazakhstan a gwnaeth Uzbekistan yr un peth oherwydd diffyg talu nôl dyledion. Dŵr fel arf gwleidyddol. Fy'r defnyddio dŵr hyd yn oed fel offerynnau atal datblygiad economaidd a chymdeithasol. Mae'r enghreifftiau dwi eisoes wedi sôn amdano nhw yn dangos sut y gallwn ni wneud hynny, ond nid yw chwaith yn amhosibl meddwl am ffyrdd y gellir defnyddio dŵr mewn brawchiaeth a therfysgaeth yn wir, ond ni dyna sy'n digwydd y funud hon yn Mariupol yn Wcrain gyda'r cyflenwadau dŵr yn cael eu bomio. Ac yna wrth gwrs mae cyflenwadau dŵr fresh yn medru bod yn dargedau milwrol. Yn 2001 fe fomiodd yr Unol Daleithiau gyfleusterau hydroelectric Argai Kajaki yn rhanbarth Helmand o Afghanistan, gan dorri ffwrdd y cyflenwad trydan o ddinas Kandahar. Felly dadleuon ynglŷn â pherchnogaeth cyflenwadau dŵr, defnyddio dŵr fel arf milwrol neu arf gwleidyddol, defnyddio dŵr i atal datblygiad economaidd a chymdeithasol yn offerynnau brawychaeth a therfysgaeth neu fel targedau milwrol. Mae dŵr yn arf hyblyg a phwerus, yn arf a all ddinistrio neu yn rhywbeth a all sicrhau llwyddiant cenedl. Dŵr, heddwch, iechyd. Mae'r mynegai tlodi dŵr yn mesur adnoddau dŵr, faint o bobl gallu ddefnyddio, pa ddefnydd awn eir ohoni, dau heffaith ar yr amgylchedd. Mae diffyg cyflenwadau dŵr glân a diogel a systemau carffosiaeth effeithiol a digonol yn argyfwng rhyngwladol. Mae 1 o bob 6 person dros 1.1 biliwn yn gorfod ymrafael yn ddyddiol a byw heb ddŵr diogel, a 2.6 biliwn, dwywaith y ffigwr, 1 o bob 3 heb gyfleusterau carffosiaeth o unrhyw fath. Ac ar ben hyn i gyd, fe ddaw newid hinsawdd, fel roedd Rowan yn sôn. Amcangyfrif y Cenhedloedd Unedig yw y bydd 150 miliwn o ffoaduriaid amgylcheddol ar y blaned erbyn diwedd y ganrif. Pobl wedi gorfod symud o'i cartrefi am resymau amgylcheddol. Y rhan fwyaf oherwydd bod lefelau'r môr yn codi. 15 miliwn ym Bangladesh, 10 ar 20 miliwn yn China, 10 ar 20 miliwn yn yr India, 15 miliwn yn yr Aifft, 30 miliwn yng ngwledydd eraill y byd. Bydd angen dŵr ffres ar bob un o'r rhain, dŵr i gadw'n lan, dŵr i yfed, dŵr i ddyfrhau eu cnydau. Gai orffen felly drwy ddychwelyd at eiriau Koichiro Matsura. It is no exaggeration to say that if water is in crisis, development is in crisis too. The development of legal frameworks for the equitable sharing of water resources is key to peace and stability, without which there can be no development. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am wrando.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi hefyd, Hefin, am gyflwyniad arbennig iawn. I ni wedi clywed llawer o bethau bore yma'n barod i'n sobri ni. Ond ar y diwedd fyna, oedd y cyflwyniad hwnna'n dod nôl at yr hyn oedd gan Dr Owen Williams I ddweud ar y cychwyn, sef y mater hwn o rannu adnoddau yn deg yn y byd. Reit, wel na ni wedi clywed triawd rhyfeddol ac mae'n gyfle I chi nawr I ofyn cwestiynau. Dwi'n edrych o gwmpas. Reit, dyma ni yma Q&A a dwi fod I ddarllen. Reit, cwestiwn gan Ian Thomas. Dr Hefin Jones, oes posibilrwydd neu berygl y defnyddio'r dŵr Cymru yn arf wleidyddol yn yr ymgais dros annibyniaeth? Ie, wel, dyna chi gwestiwn da.
Wel, dim y cwestiwn o'n I wedi ei ddisgwyl, ond dwi'n credu mae hwn yn gwestiwn sydd wedi codi mewn seminarau ac mewn trafodaethau dwi wedi cael gyda myfyrwyr yn y brifysgol hefyd. A dwi bob amser, dyn ni fel y Cymru, wrth gwrs, dyn ni'n mynd nôl I feddwl am Dryweryn, dyn ni'n meddwl am nifer o'r cymoedd mae gafodd ei boddi. Fel arf gwleidyddol, dwi'n siŵr fod yna bosibiliadau ac fe fydd yna eraill fan hyn, fe fydd yna bobl fel Colin ac yn y blaen yn llawer fwy galluog na fi I ateb hwn. Hynny yw, mae'n codi pob math o gwestiynau yn ydy o. Mae'n codi cwestiynau o ran cenedligrwydd ac annibyniaeth a iawn yw fod dŵr Cymru, fel y drafodaeth fi a sydd o hyd yn dal gyda Tryweryn, a iawn yw bod na ddŵr yn cael ei dynnu allan o Gymru mwyn sicrhau trefi a bwrdeistrefi mewn gwlad arall mewn ffordd yn Lloegr, yndyfe? Felly mae hynna'n gwestiwn. Ar yr un pryd, dwi'n credu fod yna gwestiwn hefyd brawdoliaeth, mae yna gwestiwn moesol hefyd I raddau. Dyn ni'n byw mewn rhan o'r wlad, mewn rhan o wledydd Prydain, sy'n derbyn llawer iawn o law. Hynny yw, mae'n tirwedd ni yn casglu glaw, onid bod yn frawdol, onid bod yn bartneriad i'w rhannu adnoddau. Felly, dwi'n siŵr bod Ian yn mynd I fod yn siomedig, oherwydd dwi ddim yn ateb ei gwestiynau yn benodol. A'r rheswm am hynny yw, pan fydda i'n trafod hyn, dwi'n gweld y ddwy ochr, a mae'r ddwy ochr yn dadlau yn ymhenni. Fydden ni falch iawn I glywed beth sydd gan banelwyr eraill I ddweud.
Ie, wel, diolch. Mae'n sicr yn gwestiwn dyrys. Gadewch I ni obeithio gyda phobeth gallwn ni na fydde fe yn troi yn arf treisgar, arf wleidyddol yn un peth efallai. Ond dyna ni, mae Colin yn mynd I ddod I gynnig sylw fan hyn. Colin.
Thank you. I think there's a very broad hint there that I might want to come in from Hefin. Yeah, I mean, for 2 points I'd like to make. First is questioning, when does a tool of politics become a weapon? You know, I mean, we think of tool as legitimate and weapon as somewhat more questionable. And I think that water has been used as a tool of politics quite clearly within Wales. And this is a second distinction between the material control over it, i.e. who controls the water and where it goes and who gets to use it. And the way in which it has been used, of course, is part of the narrative of the way in which Wales does not control its own natural resources. And the latter has already been well established for several decades with relation to the building of reservoirs in Wales and control of Wales as part of the narrative over Wales not controlling its own destiny. So we're already in that territory of the narrative. And like heaven, I mean, I sincerely hope it doesn't get transferred into the material world of turning the taps off, because I think that would be utterly disastrous from a humanitarian perspective. But I think it's already there as a tool of politics in shaping the narrative of Wales having a control over its own resources.
Mae sylw fan hyn hefyd gan Einir Young yn nodi wrth gwrs bod yn gwestiwn fan hyn o cael tal teg am yr adnoddau naturiol sydd gan Gymru. Yn sicr, falle un sylw, and I shall say this in English, because one thing that struck me there listening to Colin, of course, that in Welsh we use the word arf for both arm and tool. So that's interesting. Erfyn, perhaps more tool, but arf as well. I've got a pot in the kitchen gyda arfau cegin, the arms of my kitchen, and I think it's the tools of the kitchen. Anyway, dyma ni, nôl at y cwestiynau. Anonymous attendee fan hyn yn gofyn, does water scarcity mean that population control globally is even more important? Na I adal hwnna I chi gael meddwl. A cwestiwn arall wedyn, o'n I ddim gan bwy, does the panel feel that water scarcity should be a valid reason for seeking refugee status? Dau gwestiwn diddorol. I think, just to check, bod Rowan Williams wedi gorfod yn gadael ni. Dwi ddim yn gallu weld yma nawr. Rowan, os ych chi yna, mae croeso i chi ymuno yn y sgwrs, ond o'n i'n deall bod chi'n gorfod gadael. Felly, yeah, those two questions, Colin a Hefin, dwi'n gwybod pwy sy'n yn barod i ateb yn naill neu'r llall yn gyntaf.
So I'll have a go at the second, and then I'll be a coward on the first. On the second, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like anything else. It's like food. If you do not have the means to continue to live, you will move to try and find that means, whether it's food, whether it's water, indeed whether it's health, or whether it's fleeing conflict. I think that should absolutely be part of refugee status, and I think this is one of the big challenges which we're facing at the moment, albeit that the Ukrainian conflict is dominated headlines. As a colleague of mine has pointed out, COP26 wasn't that long ago, and how often do we hear about the follow-up from COP26 in the headlines now? But that's with us, and for the majority of people on the planet, COP26 is actually far more important than the Ukrainian conflict, devastating though that conflict is for people in the region. And we tend to, I think we've got to refocus a little bit and make sure that we don't forget about climate change, environmental degradation, because these are the long-term things which are going to have an impact upon all of our lives. The first one, I honestly don't know where to start with that, and I don't know what I think about it, because it's balancing so many complicated issues, both about the material world, but also about morality and individual choice on this. And I do not know my own mind, to be brutally honest with colleagues, about where I stand on that, because I understand the material pressures, but I also understand the rights of individuals to choose, and the very strongly held positions, both moral and religious, held by people over reproductive rights. So I think that's I don't have an answer to that. I'm going to be a coward on that, I'm afraid.
Mae hwnna'n ddigon teg, yn sicr mae yn gwestiwn dyrys. Hefyd, os gyda ti sylw penodol, un peth falle hoffen ni daflu mewn, dwi'n siŵr os nes i ddeall ni iawn. Enghraifft ffigurau bod yna 160 miliwn o bobl yn dibynnu ar un afon. Iawn, dwi'n mynd amenad ydy afon Nil yn glamp o afon hir, ond oedd yn swnio'n llawer i fi. Ac ar yr un, ar law arall wedyn, mae dim ond 2.5% o'n dŵr ni sy'n dŵr ffres. Felly mae yna gwestiwn fan hyn, unwaith eto, ynglyn â rhannu'r adnoddau, mae'n deg. Byddwn ni'n clywed gan beiriannydd yn y sesiwn nesaf ni, ond rhyw feddwl ydw i, oes na ffordd i glido dŵr at bobl yn hytrach na bod pobl yn gorfod dod ar ôl y dŵr. Hwna siwr o'n gwestiwn cwbl hyrt, ond dyna fi daflu hwnna i'r pair hefyd.
Dydy o ddim yn gwestiwn hyrt o gwbl Mererid, ac mae'n berffaith wir. Y bobl yna yn Affrica, wrth gwrs, sy'n dibynol ar y Nil, maen nhw dros 10 gwlad. Dyna'r union broblem, neu dyna'r union her, falle, ddylen ni ddweud, sydd gennym ni yn y Dwyrain Canol, ble mae'r Tigris a'r Euphrates, mae gymaint o wledydd yn dibynnu ar y gwledydd ar y gwledydd hyn. Ac yn sicr un o'r pethau sydd angen edrych arno fe, a dwi'n edrych ymlaen i'r sgwrs beiriannol fel petai, i weld be ydy'r posibiliadau. Da ni wedi clywed yn ystod y dyddiau diwetha am yr olew a'r nwy sy'n cael ei drosglwyddo ar draws cyfandir Ewrop, er enghraifft, a pa rwystredigaethau sy'n mynd i fod fan honno. Ydy'n bosib gwneud hynny am ddŵr. Dwi am ddilyn ymlaen o'r hyn nath Colin ddweud hefyd, ond mae fydden ni'n dweud fod y ddau gwestiwn yn hollol ynghlwm yn ei gilydd sydd yn y Q&A yma. Mae'r ddau o'n nhw'n gysylltiedig. Dwi'n cytuno 100% â Colin bod rhaid bod dŵr yn cael ei dderbyn fel rheswm am fod yn mudo, am fod yn symud o un man i'r llall, a dwi'n credu bod e'n gwestiwn fydd rhaid i ni yn y gwledydd hyn ofyn ac yn Ewrop ac yn y gorllewin yn gyffredinol, gan gofio mae gyda ni dechreuodd chwyldro diwydiannol ac yn y blaen. Faint o ddyletswydd, onid oes dyletswydd arno ni i sicrhau pan fydd bobl ar ynysodd y Môr Tawel, pan fydd yn Delta Bangladesh ac yn y blaen, pan fydd y tir yn mynd o dan y dŵr, onid oes dyletswydd arno ni i gynnig cartrefi, i gynnig lleoliadau iddyn nhw i ddod i fyw. O ran y boblogaeth, mae yn anodd, mae hwn yn gwestiwn anodd oherwydd mae yna agweddau traddodiadol, agweddau crefyddol, agweddau diwylliannol yn dod i mewn. Ond os yna ddim un dwywaith nad ydy y cynnydd yn y boblogaeth, yn arbennig yn rhai mannau o'r byd, yn rhan o'r her fawr ynglyn â chyflenwadau dŵr ffres. Ond mae hwn wedi ni yn cysylltu Mererid yn gyflym iawn ag iechyd, fedrwn ni ddim dweud wrth bobl eraill o gwbl be wneud os nad ydyn ni'n gyntaf yn sicrhau fod yna iechyd i'r boblogaethau hynny. Pam mae gennych chi deuluodd mawr yn rhannol, oherwydd mae yna nifer fawr o'r plant yn marw pan fyddan nhw'n ifanc, mae angen edrych ar ôl mewn hunent ac yn y blaen. Felly mae'r cwbl i gyd ynghlwm yn ei gilydd, ond yn sicr fedrwch chi ddim gwahanu y ddau beth.
Gai ofyn i chi felly a gweld bod yr amser ni bron ar ben. O'ch chi'n defnyddio'r gair herf yna hefyd. Dwi bob amser yn gobeithio bod y gair her yn golygu rhywbeth y gellid i oresgyn. Hynny yw, dydy'r pethau yma ddim yn amhosibl. Mae dyle hi fod yn bosibl gyda'n adnoddau galluog, mynyddol a materol ni i ddod dros yr heriau hyn o ran iechyd a dŵr falle'n benodol. A hynny wedyn gobeithio'n arwain at fyd mwy heddychlon. I chi'n nodio'ch pen ydy Colin yn cytuno?
Yes, I was just reflecting about a conversation we had a while ago, Mererid, which I'm going to share with colleagues, much to Mererid's embarrassment. Mererid once said to me, "Oh dear, Colin, I fear as though I'm being far too idealistic about the world." And I corrected her by saying, "No, you're just being optimistic." And I think that that's a way of thinking about the world, that we can start to be optimistic, but there is a way out of this. But there is still a role for progressive politics, for progressive action, to try and improve the human condition. So I apologise to Mererid for potentially embarrassing her on this, but I think that's an important distinction we make, that sometimes we feel, oh dear, we're being idealistic, whereas actually what we're doing is we're being optimistic, and we should be proud to be optimistic about the future.
Wel, mae hwnna siŵr yn lle da iawn i ni orffen gyda nodyn o optimistiaeth. Mae yna gwestiwn wedi dod i Craig, ond dwi'n mynd i ddal y cwestiwn yna nôl os Cai, a dwi'n mynd i wahodd ni gyd i gael jyst eiliad fach nawr, a byddai'n gwahodd yr athro Richard Bowen i ymuno gyda ni. Dwi ddim yn ei weld e fan hyn nawr, ac mi oedd e gyda ni ar y dechrau. Felly, Richard, os wyt ti'n clywed, gobeithio gallu di ymuno gyda ni. Wrth bob i wneud hynny, felly, dwi am ddiolch o waelod calon i Dr Rowan Williams, Jones, i Dr Hefin Jones ag i'r athro Colin McGuinness am roi dechrau rhagorol i'r diwrnod yma, a gadewch i ni obeithio bydd yr heriau a'r optimistiaeth yn para gyda ni weddill y dydd, ac ar y gair, dwi wedi gweld bod Richard Bowen wedi ymuno ni. Felly Colin a Hefin, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, gewch chi aros, gewch chi ddiffodd y camera, gewch chi fynd i wneud paned o de, fel y